tell me about yourself. What got you into art?
I would say I was a creative child, and I started being interested in fine crafts because of my grandmother. And when it came to picking a route in college, I found that the philosophy behind aesthetics, or what people found beautiful, was interesting. So then that's what got me into art. First, my grandmother, but also a little bit the idea of explaining why humans create, and that's what I'm interested in.
Much of your work consists of depictions of American culture. What drew you towards this topic?
I'm an immigrant. I've always been interested in the process of enculturation. So how do the process of belonging, right?
Yeah.
How do you get to belong in a family pod? How do you get to belong as a female? How do you get to belong
How do you,
as a
like,
Canadian, as an American?
integrate into society, basically?
Correct. How do you
Yeah.
integrate in society? It tends to be pretty difficult for autistic people to integrate. So we learn the process very early that's called masking. So putting on the mask that society expects you to have in order for you to fit in.
The normal
And-
person mask, essentially.
Correct.
Yeah.
The normal person's mask. So I got very interested as to that process that other people go through, because it's a learned process. It's just that it's easier to learn for people that aren't on the spectrum than it is for people like me. For me, the American shock was really interesting, because as an outsider, you see the glitz of America, right? The Disney, the Hollywood, the colors and the beauty and the glitter of it. But then as you become an American, right, as you learn to be part of that culture, you also see the negative. You see some of the closed-mindedness, you see some of the idiosyncrasy of the culture. So I really turned a critical eye towards American culture. It really is not that critical. It's a very fascinated eye towards how we grow. The American culture consumes, right? It absorbs everything else. It absorbs part of other cultures, and it makes it American. It makes it Disney. It makes it colorful and shiny, but also very scary. It feels like a good metaphor of that is Snow White, right? How bright and colorful and gentle it looks, but how violent a tale can that be?
Probably applies to like a lot of fairy tales, really.
It applies to all fairy tales, but I think that the American dream is the contemporary fairy tale, right? It is
The American
gloomy
dream,
and
yeah.
scary and consuming, and if you're not careful for the actual underground of what's really happening, there's a moral somewhere in there that I haven't found yet. But I think the American dream is a contemporary fairy tale, just as scary and as moral, and as foreboding as the German fairy tale that we grew up with, as the French fairy tale that I grew up with.
So my next question is actually about fairy tales. Much of your work consists of references to fairy tales and other such similar forms of media. And what inspired you to include these references in your art?
I think they were references to female experience. They were part of how I learned to be a female, but they also a reference to things that I never kind of could quite access. I am not the most feminine female. I'm not the most princessy of people. I'm fall a little bit more in the in between, in the gender neutral kind of process for most of what I do. So again, that's something that fascinates me, but also the fact that fairy tales are present in children's life as beautiful story, but when you dig into them, the reality is the historical stories are very dark.
Yeah.
They're a lot darker than Disney, right? They're a lot darker.
Yeah, they were modified when they were introduced into American culture. Like, I think the original story of Cinderella, like the stepsister like cuts off their foot basically or something to try and get it to fit in the slipper, if I recall, something like that.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And that's something that's part of French culture too. The fairy tales I grew up with were a lot darker than
Yeah.
the fairy tale I was presented with in America, but they were still not always as empowering as I wanted them to be
Mm.
for the female characters. And those are the characters I was interested in. I'm interested in the characters that are the underdogs, the characters like Donkey Skin, for example, that are making their own path, that aren't waiting for a prince to save them.
Hmm.
Characters that the witches and the deer and all those animals that get caught in the aftermath of whatever drama happens in the forest, the witnesses and the bystander. And really, most of those characters in my artwork are metaphors for bystanders of the American culture.
What is the importance of textiles in your work?
It is the common thread to everything I do, is because it connects to my root. It connects to the female kind of part of the work that I'm doing, but also it's the art that has always written the history of a people, right? The arts and crafts has always been the way that female passed on their memories, their opinion,
For most of human history, yeah.
to achieve history. That's when those knitting circles and those exchanges, those knits and bits, were always the opportunity they had to be political and to actually place an opinion out there.
Hmm.
And those are forms of art that have been relegated to arts and craft museum and not the fine art galleries and the fine art museum for much too long, alienating not only females and their voice, but also indigenous voices, and the voices of diversity, really, because they weren't the male European ideal of art making.
Uh-huh. The expectation, essentially.
The expectation for painting, sculpture, and and those colonial European Renaissance artwork. It's not that it doesn't fit. I disagree with that, and the textile is why how I bring back the power to the indigenous people, the part of my roots that I am interested in, and power to the women that had a voice through their fine crafts as well.
Don't miss the opening of Rebecca Schwarzberg and Veronique Cote's exhibit on Friday, September 2nd at 3 p.m.